Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to introduce the next fireside chat between Mr. David Malpass and Mr. Gerard Baker. President of the World Bank since 2019, Mr. Malpass began his mandate during a very difficult period for the world. He has since worked tirelessly to support countries hardest hit by the pandemic and the economic shutdown. During his mandate, he will be leading global efforts to end poverty and boost shared prosperity. The development of the COVID-19 vaccine is a major testament to modern science and human ingenuity. It also shows that many of the unprecedented challenges that we face today can only be met by international cooperation at every level. As the distribution of the vaccine begins, we can finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Today, Mr. Malpass will share his insight on how we can ensure that the global recovery is not just resilient, but also inclusive. I would like to thank Mr. Malpass for joining us today so that we can have this important conversation. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Mr. David Malpass.
Thank you very much indeed for that. It's a great pleasure to be here, not to be there, but to be here. Thanks very much indeed, David Malpass, President of the World Bank Group, for joining us for this fireside chat. David, let me start by asking you just heard there, obviously, we're all very focused on the COVID-19 and the developments, obviously, this incredibly difficult year that we've all faced. All looking forward, I think it's fair to say, to a new year that while it will continue to be a challenge, we at least have in the pipeline already rolling out the vaccine and perhaps the early signs of some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. If you would give us your assessment, David, from where you stand as president of the World Bank, how the next year unfolds in terms of the virus, in terms of the pandemic and its impact, especially obviously from your perspective, its impact on the less developed countries.
Hello, Jerry. Good to be here and good to be here with you. The pandemic has been severe and also unequal, and we see that also in the vaccine effort. Some countries are deeply suffering from the virus itself. Others less so, and within countries, then there's this big inequality. And so one of the challenges is how do you get vaccines to the people that need it most in the countries that need it most? And that's not a fair process that goes on in the world. So we're trying to make it fairer by having money available for countries that don't otherwise have access. So we passed, our board approved in October $12 billion to set up vaccine distribution systems in poor countries and also buy the vaccines. But as the regulators decide on which vaccines actually work, there are many elements of this that have to be put together. So what we're doing right now is an assessment country by country of their readiness for delivering vaccines. And then we'll begin that process of in which countries, which vaccines would make sense for them and have they been approved. So it's a complicated kind of simultaneous equation to try to have the biggest impact.
What are the economic incentives here, David, for the pharmaceutical companies? Obviously, we've the major developed countries where these pharmaceutical companies are based in North America and Europe in particular. Also, we've seen some in China. But the major ones, the vaccines that have already been started to be introduced, the Pfizer. We're looking like Pfizer, Moderna, and some others that are coming out. They obviously they've put in extraordinary amounts of effort and research. The US government has been very supportive in that respect. Other governments have too. They obviously are focused on, and the major Western countries, the United States, Canada, the European countries, the European Union countries, the rest of Europe, they have the resources to be able and China as well. Japan, the major developed countries in the rest of the world have been able to have the resources to be able to pay significantly for this vaccine, and we're already seeing that's where these are the countries that are starting. The UK first, US now, Europe at some point, presumably to implement the vaccine. But for the pharmaceutical companies, and from your perspective, how are they how are they encouraged to get the vaccine to countries which don't have the resources, frankly, that these countries have? And what can the World Bank and what can other multilateral institutions do to help those countries that just don't have the financial ability to get the vaccine to their people?
A short answer is we can give grants to countries and they can buy them from the pharmaceutical manufacturers. Now, that sounds straightforward, but it's not nearly as easy because for some of the vaccines, they don't have the supply. They've already pre-sold some of their supply. So I think we should also look at the positive side of this by the advanced economies, and especially the U.S., making funding available or pre-orders available to the companies. It accelerated the development of the vaccines. So I think the world should, on a first case basis, appreciate that result, the very fast development of what appeared to be at least one, and soon two, and then I hope 3 and 4 very effective vaccines. So as that happens, that's good. And then the question is how, and there's already been a lot of generosity in the advanced economies through their development assistance. They provide a lot for the poorest countries now. And so then I think that generosity extends into vaccines. Whether they do it by themselves paying the manufacturers to make available at cost, I don't know if that will happen. Some of the manufacturers have been very generous themselves and said that they would provide vaccines at cost or or even less. So what we're trying to do as the World Bank is have a lot of money available to help set up the systems to distribute vaccines carefully, and then to pay something, though not very, there's a negotiation going on in the world of how can you get very effective vaccines for a very low price. And so that's still, I think, we're looking into January, February, March, where that kind of discussion is going on worldwide.
I suppose the worry is, for a lot of people, that the inequality that obviously already exists in the world today, the international inequality, is going to be exacerbated potentially by the fact, by optimistically perhaps, but by the summer of next year, it does look increasingly likely that North America, Western Europe, China, the developed countries of Asia, they're going to have largely probably vaccinated their people. This immediate COVID crisis will be, if not over, will be very much on the downside. Whereas much of the rest of the world is going to still be, with the best will in the world, is going to be lagging behind. And and we've seen obviously the economic impacts, the drastic economic impacts of this crisis already, that if this goes on much longer in the developing world before they are able to get the protection from the vaccine that the developed world will have, these inequalities are going to be exacerbated with all kinds of economic and financial consequences.
Yes, and this is a grave concern. The forces driving the split in the world, the unequal nature, are even deep. Include the vaccine. But they're also the way the fiscal stimulus has been done. The advanced economies are able to borrow more and spend more than the poorer countries. And that's true on monetary policy as well. The central banks of the advanced economies have been buying massive amounts of bonds issued by relatively wealthy borrowers. And so that pushes the inequality issues even further. I don't know a solution. I mean, there's not an immediate solution, but what we can do is work on it. And it's very important for the poor within everyone's countries, and especially the poorest people in the poorest countries. The best thing that can happen is a faster global growth, and then some aspects of fair access to vaccines. We can really help in that regard. And then I think getting back to a system where there's a recognition of the value of biodiversity in the poorest countries, of tourism, of the remittance flow that comes from the wealthier countries. And then the final point I'll make is the developing countries themselves can do a lot within their systems to make them work so that they allow people to take jobs and have skills that develop internally and that are useful in the new world economy that comes out post-COVID. So having some flexibility in the systems and working against the vested interests, in all countries there's this problem that once systems are locked in, they're hard to change. So that's one of the things that the World Bank wants to work toward, to allow change within countries so that they can get a better result next time.
David, what's a reasonable expectation in terms of a time frame by which most of the world, especially the less developed countries, are going to be able to have this vaccine? I saw Bill Gates quoted at the weekend talking about that the reality is that this COVID will be with us in terms of on a global level, perhaps right through 2022. Does that sounds rather depressing? Is that right?
That sounded depressing. I think we should all work to try to do it sooner. And one thing I'll observe is there's quite a bit of differentiation around the world of which countries are being hit the hardest. Scientists don't know why that is, but the reality is that there's more cases and more deaths in certain countries than in others. So concentrate the vaccine availability for the people who need it most, and do it hopefully in a very efficient way. That maybe we can shorten that time period that you were talking about. So you might have, if you say, when will 100% of the world be free of COVID, that's going to take a long time. But if you say, when can there be, of the most vulnerable people, when can a lot of them be vaccinated, maybe we can bring that shorter.
I want to come on specific to the issues you've already raised a little bit about debt sustainability and about what to do about debt and possible debt restructuring for many of these countries. But just one quick final question on the specifics of our response to COVID. What have we learned, do you think, in the last year in terms of our vulnerability to pandemics like this? But more importantly, about what we can do to prepare better. And again, what role maybe you, the multilateral institutions, can play, the World Bank and others can play in actually helping us be much better prepared so that next time we don't get hit with this extraordinary double punch of public health and economic effect that we've had in 2020.
Preparation is important, but it's hard to prepare for the unknown, a virus that's very contagious and that spreads quickly through airplanes and so on. I suppose one of the look back learning is that countries need to really report in when they're experiencing an unexplained a number of illnesses and so on. So a better and very honest reporting system by countries when there is a problem. I think we can't rule out there being future pandemics. In fact, probably it's likely with the world working so closely together, with people traveling so much, that probably will happen again, but it needs to be reported right at the beginning in order for people to address it. One thing I think we've learned, which is amazing, is how rapidly a vaccine, it looks like there are effective vaccines that are coming on market. And so how amazing for science in the world that can be happening with such a complicated virus. Having the genome available and then being able to target it effectively is, I think, huge and positive for the future. So there's no bright side to this horrible pandemic, but at least we can say that scientists and pharmaceuticals and so on showed how amazingly they have transformed. Just recall the previous types of episodes that were so horrible, whether it was AIDS or it was measles or polio or Ebola or SARS in the past. This one, science has evolved as fast as we can imagine, which I think is good.
Let's talk about debt and about these issues of debt that many countries face. Obviously, the economic crisis prompted by COVID has created tremendous pressures on many emerging countries, both official debt and private sector debt. But official debt is obviously something that we want to focus on. And the fear is, and you've talked a lot about this, is that this accumulation of debt as a result of the economic slowdown is going to be another factor that's going to restrain growth, in addition to getting beyond COVID itself through the vaccine and just however long that's going to take. These countries could be held back significantly, many of them by this enormous increase in debt. We've seen debt increase everywhere in the United States, in Canada and Western Europe, but these countries are particularly heavily indebted already and face particular problems with debt service. You've already come up with an initiative for reducing debt servicing costs. Tell us a bit about that and tell us what more needs to be done.
When the pandemic hit, and was recognized in February, March, I, and joined by Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF, called for a suspension of debt payments by the poorest countries. So 75 of the world's poorest countries, the IIDE countries, could they stop making the payments because they needed the money to fight COVID. So the G20 endorsed that in April of 2020, and some of the creditors then began participating. So the countries would say they could not pay, and the creditors would say, okay, you don't have to pay, but we'll add it on to the end of the period. So they gave them a 1 year, or really at that time it was a 7-month hiatus from May through December of this year to not pay, and then it was going to be tacked on to the end with interest. And so then that immediately raises the question, wait a minute, now they're no more able to pay next year than they are this year. So can we look for a process that actually relieves the debt burden? The reality of this was many of the countries were overly indebted before the pandemic, and the global recession makes it that much worse. And so there needed to be more resources freed up, or another way to think of it, less of those resources extracted from the poorest countries. The people of the countries simply can't pay the amounts. And so the best way to do this is to recognize that quickly rather than dragging it on. You can kick the can. Sometimes bankers call it extend and pretend. You extend the maturity of the loan and pretend that it's going to be paid, when everyone looking at it realizes that it's not going to be paid. So it's better to resolve that or begin to recognize that up front. For international debt, there's no bankruptcy process. There's no Title 7 or Title different types of bankruptcy titles. And so they have no protection from creditors once they get into trouble. So that's the challenge that we're dealing with. The G20 agreed on what was called a common framework in October, but the basis of that is that all of the debts should be paid with interest over time. And so what I think is needed is to go further than that and recognize that for some of the countries in deep debt distress, there should be a resolution process earlier because the people of the country are held back by the overhang of the debt. They need light at the end of the tunnel. So that's what we've been working on. And there's a case-by-case process with some countries already in deep distress. For example, Zambia has declared or is in some stages of those. One other point I'll make is the importance of transparency in this. As you think about debt, the people want to have debt in order to fund projects. That's an important part of growth and development, is actual debt. But if a government takes on debt in a secret contract, it's very hard to evaluate whether that's effective. So I think as a general principle worldwide, governments should be contracting in a transparent way with lenders. And so we're pushing that really hard. It's like pulling teeth. It is hard. No one really wants to do it. The debtors don't want to do it because they kind of feel that they have some short-term advantages from from having it be kept private. They don't actually want people to see what contracts they're entering into, and the creditors the same way. So we're swimming upstream in trying to get principles established of transparency, and so that's something that occupies us every day. But the payoff is going to be huge. If there can be a more transparent contracting process, we'll get better outcomes.
Just let me ask you a little bit, how bad do you think it could get? I mean, are we going to, is the COVID crisis going to be followed, could it be followed by yet another global debt crisis?
It's a little different than in the past because of, I'll use the word contagion. In past crises, when one country got into trouble, a notable crisis like this was 1997, where Thailand devalued and then other countries devalued. And then all of a sudden, the global bond markets froze up. And so Russian bonds and Brazil bonds stopped trading because of something that happened way across the world. And they were all interconnected by having the same ownership. Mutual funds owned one bond and they didn't want to own the other bond because and that was called contagion. In this particular crisis so far, the countries that we're dealing with are one by one having difficult problems, but there's a difference in the debt. And that becomes important in how the crisis progresses. One part of it is China is a much bigger credit than ever in the past. In terms of the official bilateral debt, that's the debt of governments to the poorer countries. For example, the export-import banks around the world may have lent to, let's say, Zambia, which is having trouble right now. Of all of that debt worldwide, China is owed 65% of it. Japan is second with 15% of it, and the other major countries, the U.S. and France and Germany and so on, are less than that 15%. That adds up to 100% of that official debt, but China's 65% of it. So, and the good news is China's financial institutions are like those. The government ones and the development institutions or banks in China are huge relative to the amount of debt in these poorest countries. So one issue is, how do they allow a restructuring that really reduces the debt burden? Maybe by offering much lower interest rates. In many cases, these loans have been paying a relatively high interest rate to the Chinese creditors. So that's one set of issues that probably doesn't give rise to the contagion I mentioned earlier. And then with regard to the private sector debt, some of it is by very wealthy commodity brokers, and so I guess the bottom line is, I think there can be a lot of debt reduction without getting to the point of it infecting or causing contagion into other markets, because it's a somewhat unique form of debt. So important in this is that it be done in a way that then allows new lending to start up again. And that's going to be critical in helping the countries recover and get new investment. So the ideal circumstance would be where this creates a better, more transparent system so that there can be more balanced growth in the future.
We've just got a couple of minutes left. So two quick questions for you. First of all, China, you just talked briefly there about China. Briefly, if you would. Again, China now plays an enormous role. You just described part of it in the international economic system, the international financial system. It looks like we're seeing a change of administration. We are seeing a change of administration here in the United States. The Trump administration has taken a very aggressive role towards dealing with China, different from previous administrations. The Biden administration said it wants a more multilateral approach. The Biden team, I should say, said they favor a more multilateral approach. Without getting into the specifics of the U.S. policy, U.S. approach, how do you think this effort to continue to if we want to continue to integrate China into the global economy, into the international architecture of the international economy, what more does China need to do as it becomes increasingly important in the world economy to ensure that that it is playing by the rules of the rest of the world?
I think one thing we need to do is think of the question framed from the China perspective. They've been very successful in growing their economy and becoming more powerful in terms of militarily, economically, and in financial markets. And so recognizing that success. And then I think China has to make decisions on how it wants to interact with the rest of the world. That becomes important. Do they want to join different parts of the global system? For example, the Paris Club that deals with the debt that we were talking about before, where they haven't been a member. They're an observer. They know the system really well, but they haven't really joined. So does China want to do that? And how do they want to interact with other countries along this? There are going to be tensions in all areas of when countries interact with the rest of the world. So how does China find a way to do that effectively and communicate that clearly to the world? WTO and the rules of property rights and intellectual property and so on. How does China want to handle that? Be clear about that and recognize it has to be done in a way that works for the rest of the world, which has been a little bit of the problem so far.
David, very, very quickly, one final question. Climate, concerns about the climate maybe have taken a bit of a back seat in the last year, obviously because of COVID. I know the World Bank's played an important role in this. As we come through the COVID crisis, what more are you planning to do at the World Bank in terms of incentivizing and encouraging investment in green technology?
Partly lead by example. So we had our biggest year this last year in terms of climate investments. The World Bank is the biggest multilateral financer of climate, and we will be going farther in the future. We've raised our targets for that. So that means projects that do adaptation, for example, so that the poorer countries can be prepared for the climate changes that are going on around them of all types. So we can raise our spending levels on that. And then also within all these, there are constant international conferences and so on, have a focus on successful results that really help people in poorer countries. One of that might be, for example, transitioning from high carbon kinds of electricity generation to lower carbon electricity generation. But we need to keep in context that there has to be development in the poorest countries. Otherwise, you're not really helping the people of the countries.
David Malpass, thank you very much, President of the World Bank. Thank you very much indeed. Happy holidays and a very happy, let's say at least significantly better 2021 to you and to everybody watching. Thanks very much.
Thank you and to you. Thank you very much.